Practical Actions for Business Continuity webinar, the first in our new bi-weekly series. This is Mark Krauser, Senior Communications Manager for AIB International, and I'll be your moderator. Today we'll be focused on crisis management and how you can best be prepared for the next recall, disaster, or pandemic. At AIB International, it is our mission to positively impact the food supply chain by promoting food integrity, equipping our clients with knowledge, and supporting the delivery of safe, high-quality food every day. Now, if you've joined us over the past few months for any of our food safety and COVID-19 webinars and our recommended measures to rapidly respond to the pandemic, this new series that we're starting today will be a bit of a departure from that, as we'll be focused on insights and actionable recommendations to strengthen your business for what comes next in what some are calling the new normal. I'd also like to invite you to the next webinar in the series on Monday, June 15th. Amcor is a leader in the production of rigid plastic packaging for food and beverage industries. During the pandemic, they have also pivoted to produce protective face shields for healthcare workers. So it was critical that their operations remain fully open and operational. But the company had 18 sites that needed GMP audits and fast, as their inspection certificates were expiring soon. However, with travel in the US restricted, auditors could not get to those sites. Working together, we created a solution that harnessed remote technologies and kept their plant staffs safe while providing the same thorough and insightful audit experience that AIB International is known for. We call it the hybrid GMP inspection. And on June 15th, we'll be discussing their experience and how that model can also benefit your operation. Please do plan to join us. With that, I'll turn it over to today's expert, Earl Arnold. Earl?
Thanks, Mark, and good morning, everybody. As Mark mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about crisis management today. So the past few months have or should have changed the way we look at our day-to-day operations, and maybe you've learned a bit about how prepared or unprepared you were for a crisis as the pandemic has unfolded. New updates, new recommendations, new scientific findings, and so forth kept us all working in a dynamic mode to offer the best solutions. We've learned a lot while pivoting and thinking on our feet. This has changed the way that we look at crisis management forever. First, we're going to start by addressing the question, what is a crisis? Next slide. Next slide. So the definition of a crisis is very straightforward. It's a time of intense, difficult, trouble, or danger. The synonyms associated with the word are just as bleak. So what comes to mind when you hear these words? Catastrophe, calamity, cataclysm, emergency, disaster, predicament, plight, mess, and dilemma, and so many more. So crisis is an emergency type of mode that we need to go into to help resolve and get back to normal. So understanding the definition of a crisis, now what you need to do is assess your own capabilities. Are you someone who can always think on your feet and react calmly to what might be required of you in a crisis? Look around and identify others in your organization who can always think on their feet and react calmly in a crisis. A lot of us need a plan to guide us through how to react responsibly and effectively as a team to get through the crisis and regain control to resume business as usual. Having a framework for navigating through these situations will give us confidence and help us focus to handle the event. Next slide. Traditionally, crisis events include scenarios like a product recall, natural disaster, or an event that has been created from within your organization or externally. We're going to explore some of these in more detail in the coming slides. Today, we're seeing a greater number of crises impacting the food supply chain, and all at once, and each of which can have an impact on food safety than maybe ever before. While they each fit into one of the previously mentioned categories, they may have been increasingly prevalent in your operation in the past few weeks or months. Could be dealing with transportation restrictions or even shortages dealing with raw ingredients, and maybe even potentially a lack of qualified workforce. Next slide. And if it hasn't impacted your operation, you've likely read about the repercussive impacts it's having on others across the food supply chain and around the world. As you can see, British cheesemakers had to call on consumers to buy, so kind of sales plummeted. Hog farmers face devastating decisions of over euthanizing herds because of serious plant closures. And again, all of this can impact supply chains. And when these and more traditional crises happen, the impacts can be devastating. And that's why it's critical to be prepared today more than ever. So no one ever said today is a great day to handle a crisis. Seriously, we never want to have to deal with a crisis. Sometimes it feels like we operate by handling a little daily hiccups in crisis mode. For example, maybe a sanitarian called in sick and we scramble to fill that critical position. Or a big snowstorm hit and some of the workforce can't make it to work because the snowplows haven't cleared the streets. Or production ran for an hour because it was discovered that there was no ink in the code date printer. So now we have to go back and correct that issue. Your adrenal glands are pumping in full mode. Adrenaline is coursing through your veins. You are stressed, and it's only Monday. But these instances are not true crises that require a crisis management plan. These are only bumps and glitches compared to the big stuff that can happen while running a food business. How would you manage a real crisis if you don't have a plan? Many of us had several levels of crisis management, even if it was just for a product recall. But did we think through every likely scenario and provide plans and actions for those crises that have the most probability to impact our people and our business? Having that plan in place and having practiced its execution can help mitigate disruption and ensure business continuity. I'm sure a lot of you lately in the last 3 or 4 days have been maybe worried about the potential of disruptions in the supply chain or even at your facility in regards to the protests and things that are going on too as well. This is another potential issue where you may need to implement a crisis management plan if this affects you in your facility. Next slide. That's why it's critical to plan for the worst and hope for the best. So we're going to take a look at what should be considered when developing a robust crisis management plan. As a starting point, this is the list of potential crises events we touched on in the opening. It is these events that should be considered and assessed for your location to determine if contingency plans need to be developed for managing these types of events. Some of these events lead to product recalls. Some lead to business disruption. Some impact employee welfare. The core crisis team may come up with more scenarios to consider for your location, but these categories offer a starting point. We'll explore these in more detail in the coming slides. But first, I'll assume that you have a plan in place to address product recalls. This is the most major, realistically likely event to occur in a facility. And so we're going to jump into the second section category with natural disasters. So there is zero human control when natural disasters are involved. So you may want pre-planning in place to deal with the aftermath of the events. Some weather events do allow for preparation, like predicted storms, but others strike without warning. If your location might be a target for any of these events, consider contingency planning preparation to respond to the impact to your operations and employees. Let's start with tropical storms. Like hurricanes or typhoons, the Atlantic hurricane season begins actually today. And I know in the news the last few days, we've already seen a couple of tropical storms pop up. So this is especially timely. These weather-related crises may have some warning ahead of time to allow for preparation before the event happens. Structural wind damage, storm surges, and rain-induced flooding are all potential impacts. Natural disasters like earthquakes give no warning and can be devastating. If you operate in an area where earthquakes are a potential, then planning for the aftermath is honestly the only course of action you can take. Look through this list and which of these natural disasters could potentially impact your product, business, people, and customers. And as a side note, you do want to focus on your facility, but don't forget the potential impact on your supply chain as well in how you may handle if, say, critical suppliers are going through this type of an event too, and it didn't actually happen at your location. So consider these types of things in your crisis management plan as well. Next. Internally created crises are those we strive daily to prevent, but sometimes even the best and most routinely practiced protocols are not followed. Next. Negative issues that manifest internally in the operating environment can be devastating and always require a quick response and calm leadership to minimize the impact. Risk likelihood may increase for some of these issues depending upon other factors. Labor negotiations may put a facility at higher risk for intentional adulteration or even workplace violence issues. Workforce turnover may make equipment and process failures more likely due to a lack of experience or lack of expertise in operational procedures. One plant in the United States had an immigration raid that removed 89% of the sanitation department and 54% of production employees from the facility. Most tenured operators and skilled labor at the plant disappeared within a single hour mid-afternoon. I think that might fit into a good example of what a crisis could be. You need to intimately know the operation and honestly assess vulnerabilities to internally caused crisis events. It's important to consider all factors when assessing the probability of these events occurring in your facility or within your supply chain. Next, externally caused crises are circumstances that happen outside of the facility but can have a direct and major impact on the operation. We have absolutely no control over these events, but planning the response for mitigation or for mitigating the impact can provide some element of preparedness. We all have firsthand knowledge of how a pandemic can affect the health of our workforce, our supply chain, and our ability to get product out the door. Products contained in packaging that is not tamper-proof or tamper-evident might be more likely to be subject to production extortion. For example, a caller calls the company and states, if a ransom isn't received, they will intentionally adulterate our product and put it back on the shelf. Our reputation would be shattered even though the crisis is no fault of our own. The impact would be devastating. A power grid shutdown may cause food safety issues for refrigerated ingredients and finished products. Operations dependent upon municipal water supply would be in crisis response mode if a water main broke, resulting in a boil water order. Production and sanitation would have to stop until the water is deemed safe. Local, national, or global terrorism may impact everyday life and what happens at our business. A cyber attack that impacts utilities, financial institutions, or even a food company's IT system might disrupt normal operations. All of these events are worth analyzing to determine a plan is needed to mitigate these outcomes. Next. Supply chain disruption should be considered in the initial event risk assessment. These are events that strike suppliers of goods and services that we cannot control, but we must have plans in place to deal with the operational impact. In today's global economy, suppliers may be in the same town or located on the other side of the world. Some ingredients carry more risk than others. Ingredients sensitive to microbial contamination or mycotoxin risks means your suppliers should be more carefully scrutinized. What if a supplier notifies you that an ingredient they have been supplying to you is contaminated and it's already in your product and in the market? This would put a product recall on your immediate checklist. And what if your supplier or ingredient is shut down to a crisis that occurred at their location? How can you plan so that your production isn't interrupted? What about access to PPE that was needed for pandemic crisis mitigation to protect the workforce? Are any of these scenarios probable to occur at your operation? If so, then a crisis management plan may be needed. Next slide. Distribution is critical to how product makes it out the door to generate sales. What if a supply chain disruption interferes with our ability to get product to customers due to a breakdown in the distribution system? This may be something that affects the distributor rather than directly impacting your operation. Natural disasters and weather events may cause distribution breakdown. Planning ahead of time is necessary to address the impact. You want to assess the likelihood of these events to determine if a crisis management plan is needed to manage the impact. Remember, there are many things outside of our control, but we need to be prepared to manage any and all negative business impacts if they occur. If a wholesome, food safe product doesn't reach customers or consumers, then of course we're not going to make money. So including these things into crisis management plans could be a serious benefit. So internally, next slide. One more. So a plan means we have used our crisis management team to evaluate what we need to have in place to handle any given crisis. We have evaluated the probability and risk of various crises and how they could impact our operation. Our plan outlines everyone's responsibilities ahead of time so we are able to respond to the crisis in a timely manner and maintain or restore control as the crisis evolves. What's really important here is having a plan allows everybody, even though everyone is still going to be stressed. I mean, talk about a recall as an example. If we have a product recall, everyone's a little bit worried and stressed. But if everybody has a plan and knows their individual roles, it allows them to still be able to focus on the job, even in a high stress mode. We know how we are going to maintain the lines of communication to our workforce and where we are going to get new information for what is happening. We know who will respond to each step of the plan along the way. And we can pull out the playbook and feel less stressed than if we did not see an unfortunate event as a possibility. So we have to wing it because we are not prepared. Preparing for the steps defined in our plan goes a long way in mitigating the impact to our people, business, and reputation. Think about a recall. If all of the supplier and customer lists you need to track down needed information in the event of a recall are readily available, would that make your task easier and more timely to stop harm to consumers before they are able to purchase product that is already out in the market? Think about a hurricane. If you had all of the steps defined for plant shutdown and startup before the storm hits, will that protect your workforce and get your business up and running faster? Being prepared through careful planning and execution helps us succeed in managing a crisis. The protection element of the plan is to mitigate the risks to people, the plant, the business, and the company reputation. Communication is a large part of protecting our people and business, so schedule frequent times to make that happen. We are aiming to control what we can to protect those elements that are important to our success. A robust crisis management plan will give us confidence and the tools we need to face whatever the future may hold. Next slide. It is a good idea to review your current crisis management plan. What worked? What didn't? Where can you improve your responses? Update your plan based on what you have learned from your pandemic mitigation measures. If you haven't already considered some of the other crisis events we just talked about, and they could happen in your area, it's time to develop a plan to follow should such an event occur at your facility. You want to train your team and your workforce so they are prepared and know what needs to be done. We can't look into the future, but we can anticipate what could happen and prepare ourselves to best handle the events of the positive outcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Earl. If you found Earl's expertise valuable and would like to learn more, our Crisis Management online course can help you be prepared for the unpredictable and also help attain business continuity after crisis strikes. It is available on our website, aibinternational.com, and a link will also be included in a post-webinar email with additional resources that we'll send to you. And again, please plan to join us for our next scheduled webinar on Monday, June 15th with Lana Graham from AMCOR. A link to register for that webinar will also be included in the follow-up email to this session. With that, let's open it up to the Q&A. If you have a question, please do submit it through the question box over to the right side. We've received a number of good questions thus far, but look forward to receiving yours as well. Earl, first question, how can a lack of a qualified workforce be a crisis?
So that's a good question. A couple of days ago, I received a client request, and they were going through and doing an evaluation of their program and their workforce. Due to COVID and needing to reduce some of their production capabilities, they ended up furloughing some of their people. But in this process, they didn't realize that the people that they were furloughing actually had great impact to other areas and programs within the facility. And they started realizing that they were having a lot of issues that needed corrective actions. And when doing their root cause, they identified that the majority of the issues were a lack of educated workforce. Because they had left the actual really well-educated ones, temporarily furloughed them until they could come back up to business. This is just one example of how a lack of education on the workforce when it comes to the new food safety and food defense and food fraud requirements that we have on running those programs could end up having a drastic effect to a facility.
Sure. Okay, second question. What are some things that should be considered when assessing yourself and your team to determine if we have the right personnel? I'm assuming this means the right personnel on your crisis response team.
Okay, yeah. So one, you really want to make sure that whoever is on the crisis management team can actually handle a crisis. Now, that's hard to gauge if you're not really dealing with one, but when you're doing assessments like this, that's one of the key things. Can you keep your calm, quote, under fire? Two, you want to make sure then you get the right people on your team, specifically with handling things. As an example, you may want to make sure that you have legal on your team to deal with legal aspects of, say, like with the product recall, or with a type of intentional adulteration event that might be in your facility. You may want to make sure that you have maintenance on your crisis management team if you're having to worry about hurricanes as a potential crisis, so that when you're shutting down your facility and restarting, you have that element as part of your team. So making sure the right people are on the team and can handle a crisis is going to set you up for success.
Okay, and let's do one, maybe two more questions. Let's see, what is the best way to prepare if we already have a crisis plan developed?
So the good thing is, if you already have one developed, and of course we all have been going through this recent crisis, take a look at how you handled it and go back and reanalyze your plan. If there was some gaps, you want to fill them. If you did really well here, then you want to, again, still take those lessons learned on where you did well and now start reviewing other potential crises that could occur in your facility and seeing if they're as prepared as where you were from here. The last thing you want to make sure you do is practice those other crises management plans. So even though you might not have had an earthquake and you're in an earthquake-prone area, maybe practicing as much as you can on how you would do that process if you had to implement it to determine how ready you are and able.
Okay. Do you, another question just came in, do you find that the preparation in advance saves you time then when you're actually in the crisis?
Absolutely. If you have practice, and again, it's really hard to truly practice for a true crisis, but if everybody understands their role and has practiced that, when it comes time to dealing with a real crisis, you now have trained on what I'm supposed to do, and so it becomes easier for me. So doing drills or things like this and making sure everybody understands their role will truly help you out if you ever have to really initiate that crisis plan.
Got it. Practice makes perfect, no doubt. All right, let's see. Viren just sent in a question for crisis management and specifically risk mitigation to such pandemics concerning human transmission. Would it be prudent for the food plant client to involve various vendor partners who can actively contribute in developing a comprehensive crisis management strategy? So maybe the more partners, more downstream customers, upstream suppliers involved, would that be a benefit, do you think?
So definitely could be a benefit if you're really looking at, one, your distribution chain, or two, your supply chain on how it can impact your facility. And having them involved with your crisis management and having them think what they're going to do on their end if they're impacted definitely can be a great support. And having all of these various experts on their products, just like you are for yours, helping you on a crisis management plan can only be beneficial. However, sometimes you don't want to share everything with customers and clients, so just be careful on how much you want them to be involved into your operation.
Got it. Great. All right. Well, thanks everybody for all of your questions. If you have a question that we weren't able to get to or have one at a later time, please do email us at info@aibinternational.com. And in follow-up, we'll also be sending you a link to a recording of this webinar along with links to the various resources mentioned. We will also post a link to those resources on our Facebook and LinkedIn pages over the next day or so. Thanks again for joining us today, and be well. That concludes today's webinar.